Hello everyone. My name is Daichi, and I will give you the lecture regarding the radiation or remediation activities. So, let's start today's lecture. Today's theme is Exposure Situations, Volume 3. Are you ready? So, last time I talked about each exposure situation, especially about concept of radiation protection under the planned exposure situation. This time I would like to talk about basic concept of radiation protection under the rest of two exposure situations, that is, the emergency exposure situation and the existing exposure situation. First of all, in terms of the radiation protection, the very important concept under these two situations is reference level.
Reference level. What on earth is going to be referred?
First, let me provide you the basic concept. In the previous lecture, I explained that under the planned exposure situation, measures are taken, based on the concept that risk for cancer is reduced, which we might be suffered from in the future, for example, by introducing the dose limit. On the other hand, under the emergency situation, such as accidents or terrorisms, it is going to be basic policy to prioritize the prevention of serious impact on people's health caused by exposure to radiation. Specifically, for example, when an accident of nuclear power plant occurs, there comes up a group of people with small exposure dose as well as large exposure dose. And first, a specific value is set up as a reference like this. And the measures are prioritized to be taken, for the people who are exposed to radiation more than the value, to reduce their exposure dose. And if the exposure dose of those people is reduced less than the value, to some extent, the value is reviewed to seek further less value, as low as reasonably achievable. And the measures are prioritized to be taken, for the people who are exposed to radiation more than the value, with aim to reduce their exposure dose less than the newly established value, as much as possible. And if the exposure dose of the group of people is reduced less than the value, to some extent, the value is reviewed again and reduced as low as reasonably achievable. And this effort is repeatedly continued, where possible. And this is the concept that this effort, to reduce the exposure dose, is iteratively continued with further measures, as much as possible. And this referred value, is defined as the reference level.
Okay, I understand. This is the concept, that necessary measures are applied to people with larger exposure dose, by aiming at the situation with less exposure dose as much as possible.
Yes, you are right. However, it doesn't simply mean that all that is required is to reduce exposure dose, but it means that the reference level needs to be determined, taking account of a lot of kinds of social benefits and detriments. I would like to explain this point in another lecture. And with respect to reference level for public exposure, ICRP recommends to set between 20 to 100 millisievert per year, under the emergency exposure situation. And ICRP also recommends to set reference level in the lower part of the range of 1 to 20 millisievert per year, under the existing exposure situation.
Okay, this is the case of public exposure. What about the reference level for occupational exposure?
Very good question. Let me first explain the reference level under the existing exposure situation, which is simpler than the emergency exposure situation. Of the occupational exposures under the existing exposure situation, the one derived from recovery processes after the accident, the dose limit is applied, as it is under the planned exposure situation. And with respect to the occupational exposure under the emergency exposure situation, 50 millisievert is regarded as reference value. However, the higher exposure dose is applicable, by providing information or opportunities for health check-up to first responders, according to their activities, for example, in case of saving people's life. So, in other words, with respect to occupational exposure under the emergency exposure situation or existing exposure situation, It is same with the planned exposure situation, under which exposure dose is properly managed and regular health checkup is implemented. Therefore, the same concept of dose limit is applied and the values themselves will be changed, according to the working situation. Today it might be a little bit complicated, but if you consider the relevant exposure situations or exposure categories, every time you meet the case of exposure, you will be gradually familiarized with these situations and categories. So, let me wrap up my lecture by providing you the key points. Today I talked about the concept of radiation protection under the emergency exposure situation and the existing exposure situation. First, for the public exposure, the concept of the reference level is applied for both of the exposure situations. This is the reference value to prioritize to reduce exposure dose of people with it more than the value, as low as reasonably achievable, with the aim of the further reduction of whole group of people. With respect to occupational exposure, the dose limit is applied to the recovery processes, such as exposure derived from the accident, as applied under the planned exposure situation. And under the emergency exposure situation, the dose limit is also applied to the countermeasures of first responders, according to their works. Okay, today's lecture is now dismissed. See you next time. In this channel, the useful information regarding the radiation and remediation will be provided to you. If you like it, please subscribe to this channel, and do not forget to click the like button.